Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Embark on a journey into the forefront of cutting-edge brain science as we feature insightful discussions with a diverse array of guests, from early career researchers pioneering groundbreaking science to influential voices in investment communities, policymaking, and research institutions. Together, we delve into neurological diseases, their causes, treatments, and the quest for cures. Join us in advancing our understanding of the brain and addressing its ailments. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of the brain. Joining me today is Dr. Grant Mitchell, co-founder and CEO of Evercure. Today, we will discuss how Evercure is pioneering AI-driven drug repurposing to accelerate treatments for rare diseases. So welcome, Grant.
Thank you so much for having me, Deb.
I'm looking forward to this discussion, and let's just start with the mission of Evercure. And what's the journey that you've been on?
Yeah, so Evercure is a nonprofit, AI-driven drug discovery, drug repurposing organization that is committed to unlocking the life-saving potential of every drug to treat every disease that it can. So our mission is to save and improve lives through repurposing drugs.
So how did it get started? I know there's a very interesting story there with a friend, colleague in medical school. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's really a project and an organization that has been over a decade in the making. And it starts from a very personal place for my co-founder, Dr. David Fagenbaum, and me. And it starts back in school. We were in medical school and in business school doing a joint degree program at the University of Pennsylvania and Wharton, doing our MD, MBA. And in the middle of that, about 3 years into our medical training, that's when David very unexpectedly and very rapidly became ill with a rare disease called Castleman disease. Up to that point, he was an extremely healthy person. I remember even sitting in the cafeteria at the hospital with him, and he'd be picking the fat off of the grilled chicken breast that he was eating. It was just like he was meticulous with his health. He had just won a bench press competition a month or so before this all happened, and he was a former college athlete. So just a person in nearly peak physical health. And he walks into the living room of our apartment one day, and he says, "Grant, like something." And he kind of looks down at his body, and he says, "Something is just wrong. I can't describe it, but I feel like I'm going to die." And, I'd kind of almost laughed because how healthy he is and looked, and said, and we're med students and we're learning all these diseases. We're stereotypically hypochondriacs at that stage in our education because we're learning about all these different ways the human body can break down. And I said, "Don't worry about it, Dave. You're going to be fine. Whatever. It's probably got the flu or something." But I was very wrong, because in just a few short weeks from that point in time, he was in the ICU, practically in a coma, fighting for his life. Multi-organ failure, a cytokine storm was ravaging his body, his brain, his liver, his kidneys, bone marrow. And they couldn't figure out what it was at that time. And the only thing they had to stop it at that point was, multi-agent chemotherapy to just obliterate his immune system to stop the attack. And that's what they were attempting, and almost to no avail. And so they, at one point during that process, they didn't think that, that there's anything else that they could do. And, a priest came in and read him his last rites. I literally hugged him goodbye, not thinking I'd see him again. And we thought that's where the story ended. But amazingly, he survived that flare. And a few months later, we got a diagnosis and found out actually what it was. And as I mentioned, it was a disorder called idiopathic multicentric Castleman disease. And at that time, there's such little information known about it that, there was a sparse Wikipedia page that we found as med students. We hadn't even heard of it before. That's how rare it was. And I said, a few people get it every year, and most of them die within 3 to 5 years, and there are no treatments. So good news, we know what it is. Bad news, it's something pretty bad. And, that set really, I guess, both of our lives on a different track, because, David, became laser focused on finding a solution. And I did everything I could to help him. And in that moment, I think that there was, we started to call every single person in the world that knew anything about this disease. There were only 20 of them or so. And we invited them to a medical conference that we thought they were maybe going to be attending anyway, and said, while you're there, come sit down with David and me, and let's talk about how we can organize ourselves to collaborate effectively in advancing the understanding of the disease, and guiding the research in as an effective way as possible. And I'll never forget, sitting at the front of that table, telling these 20 or so researchers from around the world, from NIH and France and Japan and elsewhere, and saying, we're here to cure Castleman disease, and them almost, we're a couple 20-something-year-olds, and they kind of laughed, as said, and you could see it in their eyes, good luck, kids. But what wasn't happening in the field at that time was the proper organization and structure and sequence of and coordination of research to really advance the understanding of the disease. You had researchers that had a particular expertise in the type of research that they did, focusing on it in their way, incentivized to continue the research in their labs with the funding that they received from their sources, et cetera. And there just wasn't a lot of coordination. And so we realized quickly that this was an organizational problem, not just a science problem. And there was another moment that I'll kind of always remember, which is when we were trying to figure out who was working on this. We realized that we kept using this phrase. We kept saying, well, certainly they're doing this, or certainly they're doing that. And we started to think, okay, wait, who is they? And we started to realize that we had this imaginary medical research facility in the sky that was sort of tinkering away on diseases and research, and just sort of the way we would have expected them to, because that's what we needed. But we realized that didn't exist. And we kind of looked at each other in the eye and said, well, could we be they? And sort of, made that decision at that moment in time that maybe we can. And if we don't know who will.
So, were you going to med school when you were having these discussions and kind of asking these questions? And then how did you pivot? Because you ended up going to McKinsey and doing analytics and AI. Walk through that transition.
Yeah, in med school, it's a funny realization to come to, especially after you're there with your friend who's dying, and spending all this time going from hospital room to hospital room, and you're contrasting that with things you're doing outside of the hospital in research and an organization, that you start to get a sense of the different scales of impact that you can have going one patient at a time, as opposed to doing research that can scale to thousands or millions. And so I started to go really down a different path of trying to find solutions for patients. And that brought me to, because I did a business degree at Wharton, and so got exposed to these other paths, and brought me to work at McKinsey, which is a global consulting firm, but they touch a lot of different areas. And I went to work in their Silicon Valley office, helping serve biotech clients. That was in the 2015 sort of time frame, as research and applications in machine learning for drug discovery were becoming more and more popular, and actually ultimately joined their machine learning and advanced analytics division called Quantum Black, based in London, that we acquired in around 2018. and really then began focusing on developing tools and techniques to inform drug discovery, decision making, using large data sets, particularly at that time, medical records. Electronic health records, mining them, hundreds of patients, hundreds of millions of patients' records, to figure out what subpopulations actually perform better in efficacy or safety for certain drugs. And that's when it started to dawn on us that, okay, if I can find a subpopulation where this drug works a little bit better, maybe the same tools can be found to identify a population that's not just a subpopulation, but a different population entirely, and maybe even a different disease. And and because that was really my personal interest that dovetails with my experience with Dr. Feigenbaum, is that we're looking for drugs that already exist and are already on the market, are FDA approved, but could potentially treat a different disease. Because that's ultimately what happened with David Feigenbaum, is that we didn't have 10 years and $1 billion to develop a new drug. He was only given 3 to 5 years to live. And so aside from the money, what we certainly we didn't have the time. And so the only hope was to find a drug that already existed, to try and understand the disease and the pathways that were being activated there inappropriately, and see if we could stop this cascade that resulted in a cytokine storm with a drug that already existed. And lo and behold, really in the nick of time, at the end of those around 5 years, found a drug that put him into remission and saved his life. And we weren't trying, to cure Castleman disease. We were just trying to save David's life. But the amazing result of that is that that drug ended up working for a significant portion of patients with idiopathic multicentric Castleman disease, and thousands of people are alive today because of that discovery.
Yeah, I'm kind of, you said something, a couple of things that I find really important. The idea of they and who is they, because I do think when people have a condition or they find out that they have a disease, there's this hope that somebody's out there taking care of this. And I think we look at our healthcare system and we say it's good, and there's probably answers. But a lot of times there's not answers. The other thing that you said was it was an organizational problem too. And the research environment ecosystem is very complex, and they are sometimes there, but they're not collaborating. They don't know each other. They're not looking at it in this perspective. And so you're really at this very interesting nexus of that, possible hope, and then, aggregating information to possibly bring that hope. Can you go through, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, but can you go through what that means when you say repurposing drugs for diseases? How many drugs, how many diseases? What is that process?
Yeah. So the way we think about drug repurposing, and there's that word is used in a few different contexts in the pharmaceutical space. Sometimes people say it and they mean resurrecting. Maybe it might be a phase 3 failure that never got to market because it failed the last stage of clinical trial research, or repositioning where you actually take it through FDA approval into a new disease. But what we're talking about is something simpler and less commercial than those. And that is taking an FDA approved drug as it is without modifying it in any way and finding a new indication for it, a new disease that it might be able to treat. And so 80% of drugs or so are generic, and the other 20% that are currently under patent or exclusivity will be generic, in the next 10 years or so. And so that leaves almost all of the currently FDA-approved drugs in a situation where there's very little incentive to investigate them further because there won't be enough patent life on them to reap the rewards or the profits of that discovery. And so these 4,000 drugs that we have, that's about the total number of FDA-approved drugs, sit there waiting to be researched. And there's good science there. We view these in sort of like this football analogy, because David was a football player, that these drugs are sitting on the 1 yard line waiting to be pushed into the end zone, but with very little financial incentive to do so. And so that's why we structured ourselves as a nonprofit, so that we don't have to be beholden to those financial incentives, so that we can work backwards purely from patient impact. And our goal, and how we do this technologically, is to link all of those 4,000 drugs to every possible disease that they might treat. And there's around 20,000 human diseases. And so it's an exercise of building that matrix of interconnectivity between all those drugs and between all those diseases. And we've actually coined this term, computational pharmacophenomics. You can look it up in Lancet Hematology. We wrote a paper on this, sort of defining this field of research that incorporates all biomedical knowledge, all known information in literature and in databases that have cataloged all the drugs and targets and proteins and genes and pathways, and integrate them into a single data set, a single biomedical knowledge graph is the structure that we use, that allows us to look at the interconnectivity between all of these biomedical processes, to find the linkages between one drug and one disease and the pathways that it's interacting with there, to see where they might overlap with other disease processes where these drugs could potentially be effective.
So how complicated is that? I mean, AI, you talked about, when you got into, really into AI and machine learning, it was 2018, we're in 2025. We hear a lot of acceleration about it. We hear a lot of worry about it, but we are learning new knowledge about health and medical and how our bodies work. It seems like almost every moment. How hard is this to make those connections? Is it ever changing, or is it somewhat stable to be able to give that hope?
Yeah, it's really easy to make the connections and really easy to make the predictions. Pretty much anyone can download a lot of these publicly available data sets and write an algorithm that generates a score, you might say. The really hard thing to do is to figure out if that score is true and meaningful. And so really the whole field of AI-driven drug discovery is limited by this in some way. If you think about the applications of AI in other industries, like for example, in e-commerce, where you can A/B test quickly where to place the button on a screen to induce customers to click through faster and buy more things. You could get feedback on that button placement, within a day with thousands of users, and know exactly where to place it and know what prediction was true there. For AI-driven drug discovery, you make a prediction about a drug working for a disease in a certain population, and now you have to go through the valley of death of clinical development, and that finding the truth of that prediction will require tens or more millions of dollars and years and years. And so the iterative feedback loop element of the advancement in AI breaks down a little bit in AI-driven drug discovery. And so you have to figure out how to validate what you're finding. And one thing that I'm excited about in drug repurposing is not only is it the fastest way to deliver new therapies to patients, the fastest and the cheapest, because you're starting on third base with drugs that are already on market, safety profiles are already understood. Sometimes the risk benefit profile of that intervention is overwhelmingly in favor of the intervention, and you can go right into the patient immediately with an off-label prescription with a doctor that believes in that particular intervention. And that's what we did with David. If you think about the time to from discovery to intervention, that was a matter of weeks. We decided, okay, that's probably the drug that will work. And bam, it's in David's mouth, 2 weeks later. So not only does drug repurposing help patients the fastest and most efficiently, it's also a potential approach to reducing this time to feedback that can help unlock faster and better learning in computational biology. And so that's when we're trying to get into humans. But one step back from that and validating what your discoveries, we look at orthogonal ways to confirm what our predictions have been. And so that's, utilizing other computational approaches, like looking in real world evidence, like I described before in the medical record databases. Have there been perhaps, off-label use in that population already? Or maybe they're taking another drug for a different reason. Like a famous example is amantadine, which is used for the flu. Doctors realized that for their patients that had Parkinson's disease, who also had the flu, were also experiencing some relief of their symptoms when they were on amantadine. And so that's the kind of information you maybe see in the real world evidence, these happenstance crossovers. And so you can look in real world evidence, you can confirm activity of a molecule to its target with, protein-protein interaction predictions and affinity binding predictions. And then, of course, layering in additional approaches like, utilizing large language models to bolster evidence dossier generation in an automated way to help the humans in the loop begin evaluating these things as well. We have MD, PhD researchers and fellows that really sit side by side with our data scientists and tech team to not only help imbue the algorithms and the approaches with clinical and biological rationale, but also to evaluate the predictions once they come out at the end, and to feed those evaluations back into the platform so that it's learning to think like an expert human thinks as well. So it's easy to make a prediction, but it's hard to know if it's true.
So, in the example of the doctors that kind of understood that to alleviate some symptoms, those patients with Parkinson's and the flu, this drug would help. Do you have a doctor feedback? How do you gather that information? Is that something that then doctors publish, or is that just knowledge that just kind of resides in their office or in their practice? And how do you get that information? Because that seems to be pretty valuable too.
That's a great point. We think about this all the time, the amount of just latent knowledge that is out there, and how can you possibly capture it? There are so many examples of physicians who have been experts in their particular area that are trying different things that seem to be working, and not a lot of people are going to get to know about it. So we're always encouraging people to publish, because that's really one way that it gets out into the ecosystem. And 5 years ago, you could publish a paper and it could go off into maybe a not well read journal, and maybe it never gets seen. But these days, where you have the ability to consume all of medical literature with these large language models, I'm hopeful that some of these connections that normally get lost to the ethers and never get read ultimately get incorporated into the corpus of knowledge that we're building. We've seen this actually in our own efforts, where papers get published that have extremely compelling evidence and rationale for a treatment, and then never get used. And that was actually an example of this, where David's own uncle was diagnosed with a rare cancer, and they were told, there's nothing else that they can do, and just given a few months to live. But there was a paper that was published just 3 years prior that maybe a PDL1 inhibitor would have actually been effective in his disease. And so profiled the tumor, it showed PDL1 expression, and that actually ended up saving his life, the use of a drug that already existed that targeted that particular antigen. And so we call those unsung heroes. We archetype each of our sort of programs into these different areas of okay, what needs to be done next once we make this discovery. And that can be some additional preclinical work, to maybe validate the mechanism of action and its and the biological rationale of its use. And then we call those frontier explorers. The sort of middle archetype is clinical gems, where there's enough compelling evidence and enough understanding that we feel like we can design a clinical trial protocol right now. And then the last category being unsung heroes, those situations that I was just describing where, wow, there's a published, case study report, maybe there's a large trial abroad, maybe there's some real world evidence that corroborates this thinking. And the risk benefit profile is so good that we feel like we can just tell the world right now, prescribe this drug off label, get this to patients. It's ready to help people right now. And we've been a little surprised to find how many of those there are. I think there's just a lag often in medical research between discovery, even if it's compelling, and actual adoption and dissemination of that knowledge.
I would imagine that's a strategy that you're working through too, is communicating. And, in a world that's very noisy, and how are you thinking about communication?
It's a great point. And, I think I mentioned this to you before. We joke that we're the biggest pharmaceutical company in the world because every drug in existence is in our pipeline. But we're the smallest in the world too because we don't own any of them. And so that makes for an interesting and unique challenge when it comes to disseminating the knowledge of a discovery we might make because we don't own that drug. We don't have a sales team that goes out and knocks on physicians' doors and tries to explain to them, the use of this drug in their practice. And so, what levers do we have to disseminate knowledge? We have the publicity and the visibility that every cure receives, and we can get on morning shows and get on our social media platforms and talk about it as much as possible. And I think that does help. But we also work with, the KOLs in a particular area, the key opinion leaders, the patient advocacy groups that are focused in a particular disease area are crucial in collaborating and championing the discoveries that we find. But we think about that all the time because we don't have the sales and marketing team to disseminate this, and so we have to be creative about how we do that and really do our best to inform patients and bring them along and make sure that they're involved in how we do this.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's an interesting kind of movement out there around patient advocacy or just patients because everything, there's just so much information out there that people do their own research. They're desperate to find information, find a cure. I would imagine you get calls, you get outreach daily about trying to get some help. How are you managing that, and how are you prioritizing, because you're small, you're still a startup in all terms here. How are you managing that, because you want to help everybody but you just don't have the time, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's extremely motivating, but it's also frustrating, to not be able to do more. We receive, messages every day from patients in need, parents in need, and we are working as hard and as fast as we can to scale up our capabilities to run as many projects as possible. I will say that our approach, though, is agnostic to drug and disease, and what I mean by that is that we don't select the disease ahead of time that we're going to try and find a therapy for. We include all human diseases in our analysis and on our platform and all FDA approved drugs. And we let the data guide us towards the situations where there is the highest probability of success that that drug will work for that disease. But we also filter for, okay, yes, it'll work in that disease, but how much suffering is it going to relieve? Is it really going to be helping a population of unmet need that doesn't have other solutions? And lastly, how quickly and efficiently can we prove that out? So if it's going to require a 15 multi-year trial with hundreds of millions of dollars, then it's just not something that we can tackle alone. And so we're looking for these areas where, with few resources and a small amount of time, we can sort of be the tipping point for coalescing resources around that project and then pushing it to an evidence level that will be adopted by physicians and researchers. And so our main lever there in ensuring that adoption, we think about it as clinical guideline updates. And so there are guideline bodies in every different sort of disease area that help craft the protocols that you would adhere to when treating that patient population. And that's what most physicians would reference when making prescribing decisions. And so if you can update, if you can build information and evidence that is sufficient to be able to update guidelines and insert that repurposed drug in there, then that's what we're looking to do to ensure adoption. And that's contrasted with the idea of actually expanding the label of the drug and getting FDA approval for that drug. Since we are not owners of that drug, we're not bound by the limitations that a drug company and a sponsor of a drug are bound by, where they are not allowed to, by the FDA, to promote its use in a drug that it's not, sorry, in a disease that it's not approved for. Since we're just a research organization that's publishing good science and suggesting the potential of these drugs, we can actually make these statements publicly and encourage off-label use under the right context, with the physician making the decision, because physicians are allowed to prescribe any drug for any use they deem medically fit. It's the what we allow as the practice of medicine in the U.S. and that's what we rely on for the most part. If there's a situation where it looks like what is likely the limiting factor in the adoption of a drug in a new disease area is the fact that it's not FDA approved on that label, and that might impact insurance coverage and other issues of access, then we would consider designing a trial that would perhaps also result in FDA label expansion.
Do you see that, and maybe I'm not quite understanding this, but could there be a capability in the future for every cure where you're licensing out to physicians so that they can do those matches and then, maybe some feedback back into your capability? But just kind of curious, because if they're the ones that are trying to figure that out, is that on the horizon for you?
It's a great question, and we do have something like that very much planned. So, one of the moments, kind of a defining moment of the organization is when we received a contract with the federal government through a new agency called ARPA-H, and this is like DARPA for defense spending, advanced research projects, but with an H for healthcare instead of D for defense. So ARPA-H. And the contract was for $48.3 million, and it is to build out the artificial intelligence platform that I've been describing, it's built on top of this biomedical knowledge graph approach. And the output of that will be, a comprehensive biomedical knowledge graph, algorithms that utilize that graph in order to make these predictions, and then an actual score for every possible combination of drug and disease. So you have 4,000 drugs and around 20,000 diseases. You get around 80 million possible scores. We normalize those scores from 0 to 1, so you'll be able to compare sort of apples to apples across all potential combinations to say, okay, which of all of these combinations is most likely to work? And so all of that we're producing there, the graph, the algorithms, the scores, we are going to be releasing as a public tool. And that should be released here within the next 12 months. So early 2026 is what we're targeting. And this is a tool where any researcher or patient advocacy group or even patient will be able to log on and type their disease of interest and be able to see a sort of ranked list of what our algorithm puts out that might be viable in their disease. But we're also, being very cautious about this because, this is a research tool. This is the score that, we start with that ignites, additional very in-depth thought and research from our MD PhDs and maybe additional research in a wet lab before we would, consider advancing these things. So we want to make sure that people understand that this is, a very preliminary, directional, indicator of what may or may not work. And when we do publish those, we're going to be careful to publish them with disclaimers and also put them side by side with what are the clinical guidelines, what is recommended currently. And so when that's all published and when that's available to researchers, we're really hopeful that that they use those tools. And then we've also put in feedback forms where we can hopefully be able to receive the outcome of their use of the tools and learn from their thinking and their expertise, because we certainly can't be the experts in 20,000 different diseases. And so we hope the experts do use it, and we hope that it guides them towards higher impact opportunities. And we hope that it ultimately, over time, de-risks some of the research that they do and gives them the confidence to go into disease areas that maybe there's not a lot of people there and there's a smaller population, but if there's a higher probability that something works that we found, then maybe that gives them the confidence to go ahead and enter that research project.
So I'm still kind of focused on your comment about organizational. This is an organizational problem. Have you given it any thought? What the organizational kind of construct in this area would look like or need to look like in the next 10 or 15 years to really kind of flip everything on its head, right? We have this momentum, the pharmaceutical companies, research, doctors. What if you could wave a magic wand? What would that look like if you could create it new? Because this is unleashing something that really kind of flips the whole ecosystem on its head.
Yeah. Well, going back to you know the organizational problem that we saw down at the end of one, trying to you know save David's life and develop a treatment for Castleman disease. The organizational change that we made and how that's typically done is that you know normally you have maybe a small patient advocacy group. It's run by maybe a parent or a loved one of someone with the disease, or maybe someone with that disease. Maybe they don't have a lot of expertise in science and in drug development, but they find a researcher out there that's got a lab and says that they have an idea. And so they do a half marathon or some other kind of fundraising effort and get that $50,000 and then hand it over to the researcher. And sometimes that is effective, but I think a lot of times that's done without a top down organizational view of, okay, what is the state of understanding of this disease in its entirety right now? What is the research that would need to be done to unlock the most understanding, and in what sequence would that project take place vis-a-vis all the other potential projects that you could do in that disease? And so we stepped back from just trying to fund the lab that was interested in a particular project, and first get the landscape of all understanding of the disease. What is the comprehensive understanding of how Castleman disease works? What are the outstanding questions that still exist in terms of its etiology and its function? And what would be the most impactful single study to be done? And then once you determine what that study was done, we didn't then just hand over funds to the person that happened to be working on it in the lab. If it's proteomic analyses or whatever, or whatever analysis that you want to do, we then found okay, who's the world's best at doing that kind of proteomic research? And so it was more of a organizing and resource distribution effort from the top down that first gained a comprehensive understanding of the disease and the gaps in the research, and then directed resources to the most expert and experienced researchers in that type of research, not maybe just in that disease. So that's an approach that we've encouraged other patient advocacy groups to also take. But I think to your question around, okay, now how does organization need to improve for the type of work that we're doing? I think you could divide that into the world of, technical advancement of our platform, but also advancement of the discoveries and or hypotheses once they're made. And that's more into the world of traditional drug development. On the technical side, I think organization is going to, basically, I think organization is going to be focused on the aggregation, harmonization, and sharing of data. There is a ton of data out there, and there's more being compiled every day. But right now, the hardest part about working with it all is making sure that it's structured in ways that are able to be harmonized with other data sets so that we can compile them and integrate them into our analyses. That's why we're a nonprofit, is, that one, we hope to share the tools that we make and that they can be used by others, but also that others can share with us. We're designed to be collaborative and non-competitive, and we're ready to, accept other people's work so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We use this analogy of the apple orchard, where, some groups are out there planting the seeds. Some groups are out there, watering and fertilizing the soil and tending to the orchard, or maybe even picking the apples. But we're at the very end of that whole process, where we don't want to be necessarily generating these data sets or harmonizing, et cetera. We just want to be at the very end so that we can squeeze the juice and benefit from all of the other efforts that are going on out there that are generating these types of data. And then when it comes to, collaborating on and organizing around launching and advancing efforts in the clinical phase, from there we have an interesting problem or task as the nonprofit structured in the way we are, because as I said before, when you're agnostic to disease, that gives you the luxury of going into the highest, probability of success projects, because you didn't a priori limit yourself to a particular disease area. However, that means any possible disease might pop up as a high priority for us. So it's difficult for us to build infrastructure around a particular disease space because we don't know if we're ever going to utilize that infrastructure. So we have to stay very lean and nimble in terms of what we bring in-house versus what we outsource. And so a ecosystem of contract research organizations and academic centers and KOLs that we can sort of pull on as needed, that can, as a whole, help us build out this network of experts that can help us advance projects is crucial. And so we're very much in the process of identifying partners across the ecosystem on that front, and partners that are mission aligned with us, that, that can maybe are large enough that they have the capacity to do pro bono work or deeply discounted work in a CRO to support these kind of efforts. And so if anyone is hearing this podcast that has any of those resources available to them, please do reach out, because it takes, a lot of different people in the ecosystem to get these things across the line.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask, what are the biggest gaps that you're going to try to fill here in the next 3 to 5 years as you build out this capability and really build a real foundation here that can accelerate some of this hope?
Yeah, and I think on the clinical side, on that latter point, we're definitely going to need to be building sort of, friends and partners in different disease areas. So one, might be neurodegenerative diseases. Another, might be rare metabolic disorders, et cetera. But if we have, groups of KOLs and research organizations and academic centers that have run trials in this area before, can recruit well in these spaces, we'll know who to call if we see a project that is really compelling and have some of this groundwork done before we have to, set it up all over again. And then my dream is that in, 5 years time, really any project that comes through the pipeline will have a fast route to patients.
Yeah, it's crazy how life takes you on different journeys, and you probably your 20-year-old probably never thought you'd be where you are today. Stepping into the future here in the next 10, 15 years, where do you think, where do you think every cure is going to be? And, what's your kind of greatest hope for you personally, as well as for this nonprofit that you've created?
Yeah. So, you know, we're not going to stop until every drug is fully utilized to treat every disease that it possibly can. And that's a huge task. If the pharmaceutical industry as a whole approves around 50 drugs a year, and one of the big pharma companies might do like five, our goal is to be repurposing anywhere from 5 to 10 drugs a year. And so if you think about the impact of this, relatively small nonprofit punching at the weight of a Pfizer, that's thrilling to me. And to be able to do that with resources that are, 1,000th or less, that's the power of what we're doing. And I hope that not only are we able to impact a lot of lives and relieve a lot of suffering, but I hope that the spotlight on repurposing grows in general, and that people realize that this is an area where there's a treasure trove of good science and research waiting to be championed. And I hope that over the course of time, we do our part to advance the field of computational biology as a whole. I think that there's great, incredible promise there, not just in the development of new molecules that have a higher chance of probability of going through, the full research gamut, but that we're able to do it faster, and that applications in AI are not just done in drug discovery and molecular design, but also in clinical trial recruitment and clinical trial protocol design, selecting the right populations with the right endpoints, and that the applications of AI throughout the process in 1,000 different ways, each of them may be improving things by 1 to 2%. That in aggregate we create a much more streamlined, a much more effective, much lower cost process to bring therapies to patients.
So, what was the question that I should have asked, or the question you wish I would have asked?
Oh gosh. Yeah, maybe the question that I think you could have asked is, what are we doing right now, and what is happening right now? And that is that, we launched in 2022. We went through the struggle of launching something, which is telling the world about it, getting excitement about it, getting resources behind you, getting the government contracts and the philanthropic support, building out the AI platform and refining it to the point where we're trusting its predictions. And that was mostly in 2024. But 2025 is like our year of impact. It's our kind of our coming out party where we're launching these projects. For our unsung heroes, we're telling the world about them. Just a few months ago, we had our first one, which was leucovorin in autism spectrum disorder, and that 2025 is this pivotal year where we're moving from research and insights and discovery into patient impact. And we hope to have even a couple more publicly announced here by the end of the year, and get to our goal of the steady state of 5 to 10 a year that really change lives.
Yeah, that's great. So, how do people get a hold of you if they want to partner, if they want to bring resources, give you money, give you time? How do people get in contact with you?
Yeah, well, I'd be more than thrilled if people were willing to contribute money, resources, and time. There's no other way we can do this without that. We rely entirely on the goodwill and charity of others. And so you can reach out to me directly. My email is grant@everycure.org, or just go to our website at everycure.org. There's a lot of information there about what we do and how to get involved. And there's plenty of comment forums there that, if you have an idea for a drug repurposing project, we don't just take ideas from our own platform. We know that there's great science and great thinking outside of the insights that we're generating. And if you know of a drug that's going to work and it's going to help some people and it doesn't have a champion, then we want to know about it, and it can very well end up in our pipeline.
Yeah. Well, I know you've got to be incredibly busy, and I'm very grateful for your time and you sharing this wonderful story. And I think the passion and the energy that you and the others bring to every cure is just going to make you guys wildly successful.
Well, thank you, Deb. It's a pleasure being on the podcast, and thank you for getting our story out there.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.